Hi, everybody. So because I had to cancel our final class on Wednesday, I thought that what I would do is give you a very short talk via video, a kind of synopsis of what we dealt with this term and why things went the way they went. And hopefully that will be of some use to you in getting some perspective on the structure of the course and the way things were going and why we read what we read and all the rest of it. So, rewinding back a few months, we started the course by looking at some really important articles from Thomas Nagel and Ned Block, as well as what I think is a very useful chapter from a book that was written in 2009 by Uriah Kriegel. And there we just saw these important distinctions, and the two distinctions there that I think are most important to keep in mind is the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, and then from within the hub of phenomenal consciousness, the distinction between subjective character and qualitative character. And part of the reason those distinctions are important for us is that when we're trying to think about the phenomena of consciousness from a scientific perspective, it's really important to have a very firm grip on what the explanandum is, what we're trying to explain. And for a long time, most theories of consciousness, and those are the ones that we dealt with very specifically in our second week on neuroscientific theories of consciousness, tend to focus mostly on access consciousness, on the kind of consciousness that is responsible for our capacity to take in information and then generate behavior on the basis of that information at the level of action, speech, and inference. But the problem with that is that on a conceptual level, it doesn't really tell us anything about what it's like to be a subject of experience who engages in that behavior for reasons. And that's something that we need to be aware of. And so part of the reason that we started where we did is so we could get a grip on what I call these two pathways to an explanation of consciousness, both of which were present in Nagel's article. So the first of which focuses on the way in which consciousness is conceptually isolatable from functions of cognitive access. But the other conception has to do with the way in which the subjective character of our experience, the what it's likeness of our experience, is deeply tied up with the embodied perceptual apparatus of the organism that we all are, which is why there's something it's like to be a bat, and it's very different from what it's like to be a human being. So for reasons that should be clear to all of us, the main focus of our discussions throughout the course have been on this second approach, the idea that we should understand the subjective character of consciousness in terms of the embodiment of the organism. And as we proceeded through the class, we looked at some skepticism about this. We looked at higher order theories, and we looked at eliminativist theories and how they attempted to get rid of this phenomena and whether or not they were successful. And then reasoning on the basis that that particular approach, the getting rid of it approach, wasn't going to be fully satisfying. We then looked at questions of methodology, in particular the approach that we called the neural correlates approach and the neurophenomenological approach. And the neural correlates approach is interesting because it does attempt to do scientific work on consciousness without making any strong commitments about solving the hard problem, the question of why there's consciousness at all. But we saw some fairly profound critiques of the neural correlate paradigm on the basis of the claim that the content of our conscious experience looks very different in kind from the content of the kind of information-bearing states that are realized by our neural architecture. And this is part of the reason why neurophenomenological approaches to consciousness tend to not rely so heavily on what we call this content matching doctrine, but rather to utilize the first person descriptions of individuals to help reduce the signal and noise variability in the readings that we get when we're doing experiments on the brain. So one issue that we have as neuroscientists is trying to figure out what the signal-to-noise ratio is in data that we get from the brain in the context of asking subjects to engage in experimental protocols. Neurophenomenology helps with that. We then moved on to a really tricky question about how to think about the relationship between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, and that was our discussion of overflow and the possibility that we can experience more than we attend to. And that discussion led us to a few weeks worth of analysis of what I call primitive consciousness, or the question of how far down the phylogenetic tree does phenomenal consciousness go? When is it okay to say of an organism that it is probably conscious? And when can we safely deny consciousness to a living being? And that's a very difficult question to answer, because it asks us to consider what those basic mechanisms of consciousness are. And one such mechanism that we explored in some detail is the mechanism of homeostasis, or homeodynamic self-regulation, the capacity of the organism to maintain its boundary in the face of perturbations from without. Then we also took a look at the various ways in which philosophers and scientists have thought about emotion and the centrality of emotion to our most basic kind of consciousness. Having explored some of these more foundational, biologically basic forms of consciousness, then immediately raises the question of how that basic embodied sentient presence or awareness develops into the robust, rational, linguistic, explicitly self-conscious, intersubjective, cultural awareness that all of us more or less take for granted. How does that happen? And to that effect, we spent a week looking at some really important literature in the developmental psychology that goes some way to helping us understand how young children slowly, through a process of enculturation and feedback from their adult caregivers, learn how to internalize norms. Norms about how to treat other people, norms about how to organize the contents of their perceptions according to rules. And the more sophisticated we get at that, the more that empowers us to be able to interact with other people in a way where we are able to differentiate between not only the history of ourselves and the history of the world, but our history and the history of others, and how those intersect and disconnect. This discussion of development led into two important subsequent discussions, one about affordances and one about salience and affective bias. And the reason those discussions are important is because it gives us a way of thinking about how consciousness in its most basic instance links up to the world in a way that facilitates adaptive, intelligent, and skillful action on the part of the subject who's enjoying that experience. And so the affordance literature is a way of stitching that conversation very deeply into a theory of perception and into the theory of evolution. The salience and affective bias literature is there to help us understand how the perception of norms in conscious experience does not just happen when things are explicit and powerful and emotionally intense, but it also happens at a tacit level almost constantly in your pre-reflective everyday interaction with the world, which is part of the reason why your basic perceptual encoding of particular objects happens in terms of their availability to you, in terms of their basic value and purpose to you, and that is the means by which your attentional habits are constructed, which of course has a deep conditioning influence over what shows up for you as salient and obvious and relevant, and what doesn't show up for you because it's not salient, it's irrelevant, and it's not important. That basic distinction between what we want and what we attend to and what we ignore and what we don't want has this very powerful influence, not just over how the world seems to us, but how we take ourselves to be in it and how we act on the basis of that. So this, again, leads to the final question that we addressed in the course, which is the question of selfhood. Because if what we're really trying to talk about when we do science of consciousness is the embodied, affective, and agential subjective character of experience, we immediately note that even though all of our experiences, the contents change, this sense of being an invariant locus of meaning and feeling and agency is very robust indeed. And so in our last 2 weeks, we looked at a debate about the viability of understanding the subjective character of conscious experience, phenomenally conscious experience, in terms of self. Are we selves? And this is a very powerful question because it's it's one thing and perhaps a popular way to go to deny that we're selves. It's a very fashionable claim to make, both philosophically and psychologically. But as we saw in our final discussion earlier today, the robustness of the concept of self, when it is understood in terms of a process of meaning generation and self-maintenance, self-regulation, becomes, at least on the surface of things, quite viable. Now note that we did not resolve that question one way or the other. That's something for each and every one of you to do philosophically on your own terms. But my hope is that in the process of engaging with this material over the past few months, you were able at least to see a kind of story that was going on in the background about how to conceptualize a phenomena that you're interested in understanding, to look at the way science has tended to interact with that phenomena, to use the best philosophical resources to home in on the relevant point of the explanandum, and then to engage in research that varied across not just different methods for studying the phenomena, but different ways in which science, in its various guises, explores that phenomena, and then to derive from that philosophical conclusions. And my hope is that that methodology that was sort of constantly operating in the background of the course throughout is going to help you write papers that will reflect that methodology and to engage seriously with some subsection of the course. So brief although it was, I hope that this little overview has given you a kind of sense of the unity of the course and from a methodological and pedagogical point of view, what I hope to convey and how that can potentially motivate you to write empirically informed philosophy that will help deepen your research in whatever direction it might go. And I'll just say in conclusion that I very much look forward to reading what you guys come up with. And it's been an honor to take this course with you. And look forward to seeing as many of you as I can around the department. Take care.